Well, I'm here in Munfordville with Harold Cottrell, and we are here, local historian and author, talk about some history and talk about the book you've written.
Okay.
So maybe we'll start off with a little bit of local history. I know we drove around today and saw some interesting places. So maybe.
Well, we started out, took you to the old forts.
Mhm.
The Union Army had two forts over here during the Civil War, which took place in September of 1862. And the reason I drove that way was so we could go down this gravel road and scare you to death, thinking that I was going to. I think I told you that if you saw a guy without teeth picking a banjo, don't make eye contact.
Don't make eye contact. Yeah. You said this is the true Hart County down here, I think.
But anyway, it was a beautiful day, a beautiful drive through the woods. And when we got to the end of the woods, there was the Green River.
Yep.
Up just a little bit, but just looking beautiful. And there was the railroad bridge that had been completed in 1859, which was part of the reason we had a battle of Munfordville.
Right.
It was called the Battle for the Bridge. Essentially, the Southern Army had 25,000 soldiers, and the Northern Army had 2,500 soldiers. And the Northern Army had no idea how many soldiers were on the other side. And the way the story goes, the couple of guys, yahoos from the Southern Army, decided, well, we'll just put an end to these guys wanting to cross the river. So they got a little bit of corn liquor down them one night, and they shot their guns up in the air 2 or 3 times and took a few sticks of dynamite and tied up to a section of the railroad bridge and blew the thing up.
Yeah.
And all that did was make the Northern Army a little bit upset, and they started shooting, and the Southern Army thought, well, we better shoot back, and they shot back and forth for the better part of a day until a ceasefire was called. And it was obvious that to the Northern Army, that the Southern Army was way too much for them.
Right.
And I think General Buckner, who was originally from Munfordville, ended up being a governor of the state of Kentucky eventually. And I just saw where his son, who was the highest ranking officer to get killed in World War II.
Oh, really?
They just erected a monument to him in Okinawa.
Wow.
He got killed in 1945.
Wow, okay.
And it was sort of a crazy story, but that's what happened. So anyway, they General Buckner called us a ceasefire, and they shook hands. And as far as I know, this was the only battle that was settled with a handshake.
Yeah.
And I preface that by saying, as far as I know.
As far as you know, right?
As far as I
that's
know.
Fair.
Let's see, there's IMHO, but AS. Anyway, don't have an acronym for that yet.
Well, I'm sure if somebody disagrees, they'll let us know.
Oh, yeah.
But that's all right. That's what we're here to learn.
That's
right?
okay. That's okay. But that's pretty much what happened. So we got to see the Green River. We got to see the bridge. We got to see the old fort from the northern, on the northern side.
And the northern side had Munfordville connection too, right?
Yeah, General Wood. And General Wood and General Buckner were close friends. They grew up together. They went to West Point together. But Wood fought on the northern side and Buckner fought for the southern side. They never really confronted each other, but when I tell the story, I think it makes a little bit more colorful story to say that they confronted each other.
Yeah.
And they were the two that shook hands.
Yeah, well, that sounds better to me. Yeah, exactly.
Well, I know. History gets things sort of messed up every once in a while. They forget that it's good storytelling.
Right.
And they just get the facts out there rather than the story. So.
Well, that's just so interesting too. I mean, do you think there's any other place that two native sons? I know that the story's a little, but basically their armies were on their soil fighting each other. I mean, is that we hear brother versus brother, but really to have it all in the same place they grew up.
There were some stories. I remember, I think it's Madison, Georgia. It's an antebellum town. There's about 120 or 30 antebellum houses. And when Sherman was making his march to the sea, he spared that town. And the
Okay.
reason that he spared it was his roommate and best friend in college was from that town.
Oh, okay.
And they were on different sides, but he didn't want to burn that little town down to the ground. And so that's the story why that one was spared. But
That's interesting.
they had some, and I'm pretty sure the name of the little town was Madison, but like I say, if it ain't true, it ought to be.
Yeah, yeah.
But it was that story though. That did happen with Sherman. But yeah, so we have a good colorful history. When the town was Kentucky was first starting to be settled.
Mm-hmm.
I think Lexington, Kentucky was settled in 1776, and it was called Lexington because of the battle at Lexington and Concord.
Okay. Yeah.
And they had gotten word of that, but it was people in the Fort Harrod in Harrodsburg, Kentucky, that sent out a couple of scouts to look for another place to start colonizing. And Harrodsburg's a nice little historical place in Kentucky too, if you haven't been there, because they still have the original old fort. They never got rid of it. Sure, they placed a few boards, but anyway.
Yeah.
But anyway, they so the two scouts came and they found a place in Lexington, 1776. So obviously Harrodsburg was there before that, and then Boonesboro, not too far from Lexington, was around there. So, but if you think about it, that was 1776, and there weren't too many forts around Kentucky then.
No.
But in 1792, we were made a state.
Right.
And that's when we got separated from Virginia. So you can imagine in that 16-year period of time, how much work, how much surveying, how much everything was going on. There was a lot of hunters and trappers that had come into this area to get furs and everything. The Native Americans in Western Kentucky, they still had their villages, and they were still an active tribe, I think, up around the falls of the Ohio where Louisville is. But in this part of the country, you didn't see any settlements. You would only see little small groups of Native Americans.
Okay.
And you'll always hear of a little skirmish between the Indians. Daniel Boone apparently had gotten into a little skirmish with some Native Americans here. And it was out, the area now is called Johnson Springs. In Boone's diary, he called the springs Ebb and Flow. There were two big springs that he was there, and my farm happens to be on one of those. I don't know whether it's ebb or flow, but it's, I guess it just depends on the day of the week that you go down, which one you want to call it. But we, so he had a little skirmish with the Indians that he wrote about, and somebody in his party got shot, got wounded. I think they may have killed an Indian along the way. But Daniel Boone's infant son, I think was 2, maybe 3 years old, had died and got buried there.
Okay.
And so we've got a historical marker up at our courthouse. That talks about that. And, you know, so much of our history was pivoting around the Civil War. I'll get back to that here in just a few minutes. But so in that period of time before Kentucky became a state in 1792, there were some good-sized land grants given out and big tracts of land purchased. And one of them was about a 30,000 acre of land. And in 1801, there was a handful of people, and Thomas Mumford and his brother, and I forgot his name. I thought it was Richard Mumford, but somebody will try to correct me on that. So I'll just leave it that I forgot his first name.
Fair enough.
So,
yeah.
Anyway, there was 5 of them that set out, and they had, out of that large tract, they got 2,500 acres, which became the town of Munfordville that they had surveyed out.
Was that from serving in the Revolutionary War, or was
No,
it
no,
just
that didn't have anything to do with the
okay?
Revolutionary
It
War.
was
Not
just
that part.
okay.
Now, there are a lot of tracts of land where people fought for Virginia in the Revolutionary War, and the way they got paid was they would get tracts of land in Kentucky. And the Wood family, I'm not sure how they got tied in with it, but I know of one good-sized tract of land. The lawyer that lives in the Wood house, he had an ancestor that got 400 acres of land for fighting in the Revolutionary War from Virginia. And nobody really looked at that land till about 1820, 1830, somewhere along there. And so when he made the trek from Virginia to see just what this land looked like, he said, I ain't going nowhere else. This is where I'm going to stay.
This is where you wanted to be, yeah.
He never looked back. And it's a really nice farm. It looks great, and it's a beautiful place in the county. But that's still in the same family. It's just
That's
been
amazing.
passed down for the generations. And so so the first family, there was 5 of them, and there was a Frenchman in that family. And the Frenchman, they got into a little skirmish at this one knob outside of town with some Indians. And the Frenchman, trying to think of how he died, whether he got an axe in the head or got shot, but anyway, he ended up dying.
Okay.
And they named that knob Frenchman's Knob. He was buried out there somewhere. And there may be somebody that knows where the body is or where he was buried, or it may have gotten exhumed at some point or another, but he was buried there. And the other 4 in the party, but he had a widow that was the rightful owner of 1/5 of Munfordville, because she inherited it from her husband. Well, as it turns out, she was from France and couldn't speak the first word of English and had no idea what was going on. So she came this way to Kentucky, and I think the Mumford of Munfordville had bought her out. And so she never really got to settle here, and I think she went on to Tennessee. It's an interesting story, and Marissa Hale had done a lot of research on it, and she just recently published a book based on that French woman's life. She did a lot of research trying to understand what it was really like for her to get here. And so anyway, we settled a little town, and I think I took you today, Buckner, General Buckner, who, once again, he was Southern general. He went to West Point, and he was an engineer, and he loved to make things. So he made a lot of ram pumps for pumping all this water out of the ground. And we found this water tank, you and I did today.
Yeah, that was really neat to see.
It was, I know, just a big old round tank just still sitting there that was built in the, oh gosh, I think maybe 1840, 1850 was when it was built.
Yeah.
But Buckner had the water pumped up from a spring down over the hill and into this tank. And it turns out this is the highest hill in Munfordville, so it's easy to gravity feed the water out to everywhere. So it, and I think there were places where people could go and just collect water. I'm not sure how much water went to people's houses, but I know there were just places they could go and collect a gallon bucket of water here and there, or however much they needed. But it was an endless stream of water that Buckner engineered. It was a great invention.
I was going to say, that would have been a huge thing at that era.
Oh, yeah.
To have fresh water kind of on demand like that.
Major. And I don't know why he didn't introduce indoor plumbing, but
yeah,
you know, we still had our outhouses all the way up till whenever. It's one woman that came to our historical society, gave a talk on the outhouses that we had, the different types and styles. Yeah, it was actually a pretty interesting story. It was a lot of fun. We enjoyed that. But so anyway, after the Southern Army and the Northern Army decided they didn't need to kill each other any longer,
right,
and separate ways, and the Northern Army didn't have anywhere to go. So we had about 2,000, 2,500 people staying here in Munfordville. Well, that's more people that live in Munfordville today. And the
Right.
population of Munfordville at the time was 300 people. So,
That's a lot to deal with.
well, you think about it, and I've tried to think about it and tried to understand it, but they just occupied our little town, and they obviously needed food, they needed accommodations, and they just had to go to the people in the community and the farmers around, and but then they rebuilt the railroad track so that as it got close, 1863, 64, that railroad track became very functional.
Oh, okay.
And we had a guy named, well, his last name was Smith. I forget his first name. It doesn't matter. He was one of the Smiths.
Yeah.
And he had a food processing plant down at the depot where the trains would stop.
Oh.
So they expanded that, and so they would process food and ship it all the way up to Chicago, up the L&N Railroad into Indianapolis, and so anyway, that became very prosperous. But during that time, there were as many. Cook's army came through here for 2 or 3 months. He had 40,000 in there. Hart County does not even have 20,000. We have 19,000 people in our county, but about 4,000 or 5,000 of those are Amish, so I don't really count those. It's back to about 14,000.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, I'm only kidding about not counting them.
No, I know. Well, but they're so kind of self-sufficient. It's a different sort of
take care of themselves.
Logistical questions. I know what you mean. Yeah.
The number one industry in Hart County right now is driving Amish around.
Yeah.
Chauffeur, they get paid good money to drive them around.
Take them around and take them to their jobs. And,
yeah. So anyhow, the story of Munfordville in the Civil War was not about the shooting and the killing,
mm-hmm.
and who won and who lost and what was their ideology. It was about the suffering that the families had to live through.
Yeah, I can't.
The trauma that had to go through, and just never knowing from day to day. And during that period of time, there were upwards of 5,000 Union soldiers that died here.
Wow.
Because of unsanitary conditions. And I looked at some of those records, and they were mostly young boys between 18 and 22 years old. Probably never saw the first day of battle. Just get here, the unsanitary conditions, dysentery. Some got sent home in a box. I know that one of our stories is there's at least 100 people buried in the Munfordville Cemetery, soldiers, but nobody knows where they are, where they're buried, and who they are. They have zero records of any of them. It's really it's not a pretty story, and I've asked a lot of families, did you have family stories? Did you have ancestors that lived here during the Civil War days?
Mm-hmm.
And it was, I never could find any stories of people just passing down stories from Civil War days.
Really?
Except that, there was a brother fighting a brother or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But not about the families, what happened. I mean, just think, I bet there's 100 illegitimate kids running around. I hate to say that, but, that probably happened,
You had all those soldiers here, and
and just whatever, and so I've said this to several people around until finally one person in the county said, the people were probably so devastated by what took place during the Civil War, and it was all over. They just wanted to forget it as much as they could and get back to a normal life, and that's why we don't hear the stories.
That's an interesting,
Yeah, I thought it was an interesting way of going about it. But anyway, so in 1867, we were just getting back on our feet, and I'd taken you to Richard Munford's house, who was the son of the Munford that started Munfordville. And he was a surveyor and sort of thought he knew a little bit more than everybody else. But John Muir had been in Indiana, and you know who I'm talking about, John Muir.
Yes.
Well, he had been in Indianapolis and working in a sawmill up in a woodworking facility in Indianapolis, and got a piece of wood stuck in his eyes and went totally blind for 6 months.
Wow.
And Muir was a very religious man. And the whole 6 months, he would pray to God every day, say, God, if you will just give me my eyesight back, I will use that to experience the beauty that you've put out here, and I will do everything I can to make everybody see that beauty. And, well, I guess he prayed enough, and because 6 months later, he got his vision back.
Yeah.
And he thought, well, you know, it could have been otherwise, and I asked the Lord to give me my vision back, and now it's my job to do what I told the Lord I'd do. So the first thing he decided was he was going to take a long walk to Cuba, actually.
Oh, I didn't realize this. Okay.
And this was the first book he wrote. It was called The 1,000-Mile Walk to the Sea, to the Gulf, 1,000-Mile Walk to the Gulf. Day one, he was at the Falls of the Ohio in Louisville. I guess they had a ferry boat going across the Ohio River at the time. So he started his journey by going from Indiana into Kentucky, and he set out on foot. And this is all chronicled, so I'm not making any of this up. So you can read the book.
Fair enough, yeah.
So on day 3, he had come into Munfordville.
Okay.
And the route he took, he may as well have been walking through Stonehenge.
Oh, okay.
Coming into Munfordville.
Yeah.
And that was his route. And so when he got into Munfordville, he spent a half a day talking to Richard Munford.
Yeah.
And in the house that I showed you and you took a picture of that had the water tank in the back of it.
Right.
So John Muir sat with him for a half a day and then headed on his way. He wanted to see what Mammoth Cave was like, and there's still a Muir Trail that goes down straight south of Munfordville and across over to Glasgow and then to Adair County and on toward the Somerset area, where he then headed south toward and cut across the mountains into South Carolina. But anyway, he was very impressed with the land, with the knobs, with the flora, with the trees and everything, and he just thought this Hart County was as beautiful a place that he'd ever seen in his entire life, and I had to agree with him. And so we had a reenactment of that event of John Muir. When was it? It was about 2011, 2012. And Tom Chaney, who was the best storyteller ever, he died at age 84 about a year or two ago. And he played Richard Munford, and they wanted me to play John Muir.
Yeah.
So, and I knew about it ahead of time, so I'd let my hair grow on down longer and let my beard grow, and I looked pretty rough.
Yeah.
And, but I also have macular degeneration. And I was living in Lexington at the time. That was before I decided to move back to Munfordville. And I was living in Lexington at the time. And I had to go down to Richmond, Kentucky, where the eye clinic was that I got my shot. And so the day I was supposed to play John Muir, which I did, I had to go get a shot, and I had about a 2.5 hour drive to get back and play the role. And it was crazy. If you've ever had shots in your eyeball.
No, I have not.
Just try not to get macular degeneration then.
All right.
Do your best.
Yeah.
But I had to do it, and on the way back, I had a reaction to it. My eyes were burning. They were hurting me like crazy. and I didn't think I could make it, but I had to drive over 2 hours to get back. And when I got in, this was down at the old inn that I took you to,
Mm-hmm.
that little log place.
Right.
And I sat down, and there was Tom Chaney, and there were the people around. And when I spoke as John Muir, and I was saying, "Oh God, if you'll ever give me my vision back, oh Lord, I'll use my vision. I'll praise you, Lord, and I'll look for your beauty everywhere, and I'll make sure everybody sees your beauty."
Yeah.
I mean, I was convincing.
Yeah. Say you're feeling that one.
I convinced myself that,
Yeah.
that it was John Muir coming through me at the time.
Yeah.
I felt like one of those preachers that they have in the country that just sort of opens up
Opens
and
up and lets.
just gives out that hellfire and brimstone to the top of their voice.
Oh, that's great. That's great. I mean, not the macular degeneration
Oh, yeah.
part, but the
Well, I know.
being able to pull that through
Yeah,
like that. Yeah.
it was sort of fun. So anyway, that's a little bit of Munfordville history and some of the places I took you to today. And
Yeah, yeah, and I
uh,
know. I mean, well, and I'll be writing about some of the other stuff. JTS Brown, I know that
yeah,
connections here and some other connections there. But
yeah, that was interesting because he originally was from Elizabethtown. Elijah Craig was not Elijah Craig, Elijah Creel.
okay,
Elijah Craig was the person that was uh, theoretically the father of bourbon.
mm-hmm.
And he had made himself up some good corn liquor and had a barrel he was going to put it in. And he accidentally caught the barrel on fire. And barrels were not the easiest thing to come by.
Mm-hmm.
And it charred the inside of his barrel. And he didn't want to waste it, and he thought, well, I'll just pour my good old corn liquor in there and let it see what happens. So he forgot about it. He just poured it in there, thought it was all ruined, and forgot
Yeah,
about it. And 3 or 4 years went by, and he thought, well, I better see if that's any good or not. So he opens up that barrel, and he was a Baptist preacher too. So you can imagine that he thought and the Baptist preachers, they like to talk about the spirits and the spirit of the Lord. And when they see all that spirit in that bourbon there, they think it's the real deal that
yeah,
they're sipping on there. So anyway, he takes himself a sip of that fine old bourbon that's been aged, and then he thinks a second, and he goes, well, I better have another drink, see if that's so he gets his next drink.
we've all been there.
We've been there. Oh yeah,
Yeah,
you can't just take 2 sips and make any kind of judgment.
no,
So you have to have a few more. So
yeah,
anyway, so the time he was finished, he got up and preached a sermon like he had never preached before, and he thought, well, the Spirit has really got in me on that one. So anyway, that's where the bourbon came from. But Elijah Creel, who was one of the founders of Munfordville,
mm-hmm.
must have had a pretty young thing for a wife. I'm being silly about that. Probably a really nice daughter. But JTS Brown was living in Elizabethtown at the time,
Okay,
and we were still Hardin County. We didn't
Oh.
become Hart County until 1819.
okay, yeah,
So, so anyway, Elijah, he came down and started courting Elijah Creel's daughter,
mm-hmm.
and they ended up getting married. And so Elijah Creel built them a house. So JTS Brown had a son, JTS Brown, who had 2 sons, Garvin and Owsley Brown, or Charles and Garvin.
Okay.
Owsley came the next generation.
Okay,
And so there's Owsley 1, 2, 3, and there's an Owsley 4 now those are the main Brown Foreman people. But they were very instrumental. They got into tobacco and they got into bourbon early on
yeah,
and started several brands, the old Forester brand. And they were the ones that was responsible when the 1890s hit, and they were and bourbon was being shipped by rail out west.
mm-hmm.
And what they discovered, we had a lot of little cottage industries that would make a few barrels of bourbon a year, and they would send it out there. Well, there's this little gong, dong, gongo, whatever it's called, little wooden plug that goes in the barrel.
Oh, the bung.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you normally take that out. You have a little siphoning thing, siphon it over here, look at the color, look at the smell, take a taste, and make a decision about whether you need to age it more or bottle it. Well, that's always been in the bourbon industry. It's still there today. But what was happening was guys was siphoning out a gallon or two or so and then putting something else back in it. And that would happen 2 or 3 times, so that when you got out west, you didn't know what you were getting.
Yeah.
And so the descendants of J.T.S. Brown, Charles and Garvin, came up with an idea, and they thought, we need some government intervention into this. And so they convinced the federal government, and they had some help, but these were 2 of the key people in it, that the government needed to pass a tax stamp act, bottled in bond. So when you see bottled in bond, that meant, and you put a tax stamp on it, and it has the full provenance of that bottle, when it was distilled and when it was put in the barrel and when it was taken out of the barrel. And then you're assured the government is saying what you see is what you get. And that's when it all started, in the 1890s. And that saved the bourbon industry, only to have Carrie Nation and a bunch of them convince people that we don't need to have any liquor anymore.
Well, yeah, that was kind of a short-lived.
Well, as soon as they did that, though, the Brown brothers, it'd probably gone down another generation, or maybe it's still the same ones, but the Brown brothers said, this is how we make our money. We can't do this. So they went to the federal government and convinced them that bourbon is not just something to get drunk on. It is really medicine, and there are people that depend on this for medicine.
Yeah.
And so they came up with for medicinal purposes only.
Oh, okay.
And the Brown family survived Prohibition by providing medicinal bourbon. To the pharmacies.
Well, I think they're still producing medicinal bourbon to this day.
Oh, every bit of it's medicinal as far as I'm concerned.
It'll definitely melt your cares away a little bit.
Oh, yeah. Well, it helps. It helps. Yeah. And it's there's not a doctor in the world that won't. Well, the ones that will say this don't count, but an ounce of bourbon a day is better for you than not having an ounce of bourbon a day. And then there's a few others that'll say, but 2 ounces is pretty good too.
Okay.
So you need to go, don't worry about it. Just go ahead and drink your 2 ounces.
Have your 2 ounces. And
then the others will say, well, if you drink more than that, you need to come and see me once or twice a year to make sure you're not getting any ill effects. But now the way I always test good bourbon is, you don't want to get drunk on the stuff.
Right.
Okay.
That
just, because you get sloppy, your speech slurs, but there is a point when you sip really good bourbon that universal wisdom just starts flowing out of your mouth. It's just like, and you're just like, did I really say that? And it's just like, and that's when you need to learn how to tune. It's if you just pace yourself really slowly, you'll be surprised at how smart you've become.
Yeah.
And how wise you are. It's just and that's just the nature of bourbon. But it goes under the category of, Socrates said it, know thyself. It's know thy limits, know when to, you've had enough bourbon, and then know to let the wisdom flow. But anyhow, now on that same note, I was telling you about Tom Chaney earlier. We discovered Tom and I were, well, he was in graduate school at the University of Louisville, and I was in undergraduate, not Louisville, it's University of Kentucky, and I was in undergraduate.
Hmm.
And he had a bunch of friends that were bluegrass and country singers and
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah.
pickers. So on Friday nights, he'd have a crew of people over at his house. And one of the, I'm not going to say the county, I'm not going to say who the sheriff was,
All right.
but in one of the counties in Kentucky, they stopped a truck that was full of just some really fine moonshine that had been aged about 6 months in a bourbon barrel. So it
Okay.
had that nice color to it. It
Mhm.
was just really, and it was some of the best bourbon you ever drank. Well, this sheriff did not, he just thought it would be a shame if all of that got destroyed. So he distributed some of that out to some of his friends. And as it turned out, that group of bluegrass musicians that would come over to Tom's house every Friday night
Yeah.
were privileged to get that jug of moonshine and pass it around. And we had several of those, but we finally figured out how to the way to drink good moonshine and how to discern whether it's really good, between good and great and wonderful and whatever adjective you want to use. So it just came to all of us all at once. It was just like this light that just shone on us. It's the number of times that jug goes around the room until everybody breaks into a chorus of "I'll Fly Away."
Okay.
And it'll happen every time.
So was it fewer times around? It meant it was better, or just a happy?
Well, it was just that happy feeling
Just
that
a
you
good
would
spot.
get as the camaraderie.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
just
What do they call that? A Kentucky hug?
Kentucky hug.
Hug. I
Hug.
thought
Oh,
I've heard
yeah,
that somewhere. The
yeah.
Kentucky hug, where all of a sudden you just feel this warmth inside you, like the whole state's giving you a hug or something.
Yeah. Well, I like that idea. I
Yeah,
might
I don't
have to start
know.
using that. I've never heard that one before.
Well, I swear I've heard that somewhere, and maybe somebody out there can tell us where that came from. I don't know, but
Okay.
I don't know. I hear a lot of things traveling around.
I'm sure you
so,
do.
Yeah,
I'm sure you do.
yeah. So now you told me a story, and if you don't want to tell it here, we'll just edit this part out, about Julia Child.
Oh yeah. That was an interesting one. I didn't know I told you that.
Yeah, you told me that the first time we met. So
Oh,
I don't
okay.
know if you want to tell it right
Well,
now or
no,
not.
I don't
but
mind telling it right now.
It's
I'll be brief with you because
yeah, that's
we can
fine. I know we got some other things we want to cover, but
Yeah. Well, um, my friend Paul Holbrook, and he and I got to be pretty good friends, and we bought some property together and rental property and
Mhm.
whatever. He was a theologian, I was a mathematician, so I was weak on the religions, and he was weak on the math and the sciences. So it made for a lot of good conversation to sort of get to that. Well, anyway, he had gone to the divinity school at Harvard, and he had gotten the job as being the chef for the dean of the divinity school, Krister Stendahl, who anybody in theological circles knows who I'm talking about. And so he worked there for 4.5 years as their chef, and it was nice. And all the dignitaries that ever came to Harvard or to Boston in general would end up at their dinner table, and Paul has tons of stories about that. But around the corner was Julia Child, and
she just lived up the street, basically, or you mean?
yeah, they were just
just
2
neighbors.
blocks away from each
Okay.
other, and they were all friends, and so he just knew her real well. Well, meanwhile, back in Kentucky, Tom Cheney, let me get the timeline on this straight. Calvin Trillin, Calvin's still around,
Okay.
and he was a writer for the New Yorker, and Tom had worked on a newspaper together before. So Tom and that was up in northern Kentucky actually, that they worked in the newspaper. And anyway, it was so Calvin was coming through toward Western Kentucky. He was wanting to do an article in the news in the New Yorker about the indigenous Kentucky food, which is the Western Kentucky barbecued mutton.
Mm-hmm.
But he knew Tom, and he stopped here on the way, and Tom convinced him that that was not the indigenous Kentucky food, that it was really the country ham. So Calvin spent the night in Hart County, and he met Aunt Daisy. And Aunt Daisy, he was just so charmed with Aunt Daisy, who was this wonderful country lady. She had been superintendent of schools here. She was 80-some years old at the time and just cooked up a lot of food, and stories just flowed like water all night long and laughing. And so Calvin decided he would stay in Hart County and write about it. So he was here, and this article came out in the New Yorker in March of 1979.
Okay.
And so anyway, it was just really funny, and it was charming, and it was about all these people that he met in Hart County. He even stopped. My father was making baskets at the time, the split oak baskets.
Mm-hmm.
And he even came and spent part of an afternoon with my father and watching him make baskets, and took one back to New York with him. And it was just one of those great articles in the New Yorker. So May of 1979, let's say March, 2 months later,
Mm-hmm.
after the article came out, the dean of the divinity school was retiring, and he needed to move out of the deanery to an apartment. And Paul said, you're not doing anything, you're on break from school and everything. Why don't you come and help me move Krister out, meet all these people? So I went up to Harvard and was meeting all these people and helped dean of the divinity school move, and very, very interesting. And so commencement day of Harvard comes, and Harvard takes commencement very serious. So I we were invited to the commencement party of John Kenneth Galbraith. Have you ever heard of John Kenneth Galbraith? He was a Harvard professor in economics and a good friend of John Kennedy, and he was one of John Kennedy's cabinet members and whatever. And so he got sort of popular around the world, and a lot of people knew him. And so anyway, he had the party for all the higher ups in Harvard. And so I get dressed up. I have my white suit and straw hat and,
Mm-hmm.
what you're supposed to do.
Right.
Gathering like that. So we're there, and I'm feeling a little bit like a fifth wheel. And Paul says, "Oh, well, look, there's Julia Child." And he takes me over and introduces me to Julia.
Yeah.
And he told Julia, "This is my friend Harold from Kentucky." And Julia goes, "Oh, I just read this most marvelous story in the New Yorker about Aunt Daisy. She must be the most lovely woman." And I'm like, I know every one of these people. Well, she got all excited about it and wanted to hear more. And her husband, Paul, was not feeling too good.
Yeah.
And we're talking, and before you know it, she says, I told her, I said, "Well, I feel like a fifth wheel here. I'm just sort of out. This isn't
Right.
I don't know anybody here in my crowd." She says, "Oh, well, you just come and sit with us." Well, the drinks kept coming. It wasn't long. Here me and Julia are arm in arm singing.
I love that.
Having the best time in the world. And there's her husband, and he would just sort of nod and go on. That's Julia for you.
Yeah.
So anyway, she invited me over to her house, and I spent an afternoon with her, and agreed to get her a country ham from Kentucky.
Mm-hmm.
And so we come back to Kentucky, and called my friend Tom Cheney and said, Tom, you won't believe this, but, and I tell him the whole story. And I said, but I agreed to get her a country ham.
Yeah.
So Tom gets the country ham for me. Paul has to go back up to Harvard in September, sometime along there. And so he carries the country ham on the airplane up to meet Julia Child, delivers the country ham to her, and we get a couple of letters back from her. Well, one of them said, oh, it was just so wonderful, and we've already had the ham shipped to France, and we're going to cook it on New Year's Day in France. And
that's so great.
So anyway, she gets it, and then we get a letter back from her later on telling about it. So it was Thanksgiving of that year was incredible. At our Thanksgiving table, we had 4 preachers. At least one of them was a Baptist. I think 2 of them were Baptists, but anyway, then 2 Episcopals, and then just some of the local drunks that came over to get free bourbon and wine and
yeah,
and everything, and have conversations. So it was one of these incredible days, and of course the story of Julia Child, was one of the stories that got told.
Right.
Well, then a couple of weeks went by, and I get a call from Tom on a Sunday afternoon, and he says, go get the Courier Journal in the morning, don't ask questions. And I'm like, well, what's it about? And he said, I told you not to ask questions, just get it, and call me after you get it.
Yeah.
So I go get the Courier Journal on Monday morning, look at the front page, and there's this whole story about the country ham and Julia Child on the front page of the... Only the story was told from about J.T. Mitchum, who provided the ham.
Oh.
And as it turned out, it was completely illegal. There was nothing legal about any And he was saying, oh, the government, they tell you all this stuff you have to do. He said, you can't get a good ham that way. He said, you got to have a dirt floor. They don't want you to have dirt floors. You got to...
Oh, I love that.
So anyway, that it's one of those stories that lives on. It was a fun story.
Oh, that's I remember you telling me that. I think on the way out to Stonehenge, maybe, or somewhere in there when we were that last time, and I was like, I got to hear that again. Such a good.
I guess when I heard you were a chef or something, I felt like I ought to tell
that
you
may
that
have been
story.
that may have been where it came from. So yeah. You want to talk a little bit, just real quick, about Stonehenge, since we're in Munfordville?
Yeah.
I feel like we need to give a little history of it, and then
well,
I know that plays a key part in the second half of our conversation.
Chester Fryer was another one of these Hart County characters, and he was a builder, and he grew up in a part of the county. I don't know how much education he had, but he really did like to study a lot and ask a lot of questions. And he told me this, that I asked him why he did it. He said, well, I just heard a voice that told me I needed to do some research on this and go get some rocks and make the stone circle. So he started researching about Stonehenge, and he was out the KOA where you're staying at right now is right off of Fisher's Ridge.
Okay.
If when you get off the interstate, you turn to KOA, but if you go about 50 yards further, it'll be Fisher's Ridge Road.
Okay.
And it's the back entrance to Mammoth Cave. Not too many people know about it, thank goodness, because that's the way I like to go.
Yeah.
But so he was out there at a farmer's one day and looking at all the rocks, and Chester said, well, what are you going to do with these rocks? And he says, I'm not going to do anything with them. Do you want them? And he goes, yeah, I want them. He goes, well, you just take all you want. So Chester, found somewhat of a crane and a truck bed and whatever, and he started moving rocks, and he started researching and what Stonehenge was all about. And you know, as much as you want to say it's a replica, it's really a stone circle that has the proportions
Mm-hmm.
that Stonehenge has. And but a stone circle's a stone circle, and it took him several years. He cut every one of the bottoms off, put them, you know, 3 or 4 feet down into the ground, built a cement base so that they would sit on the cement base, and then put more cement around them and filled it in with some dirt so that they were anchored. And had to level the tops out a little bit because it looks like the letter pi, you know, like
Right.
whatever.
Yeah.
And there's 5 of those, and then he got his directions exactly right. He's got a big square block in the middle with the directions on it, and then an outer ring of stones. And I've started becoming familiar with all of the stones in the outer ring. I kind of like them. And anyway, the more time I've spent over there, the more I really enjoy it. And there's people that stop in there all the time. I'd say there's, you know, 20, 30 a day that just come in, and I give them a little tour, and I try to change the story a little bit every time I give the tour, just to see what takes people. So I've got some ideas. I think I've got to run it past the family and tourism and everything, but I have some ideas how to make that more of a magical place, so that when people go there, they come away thinking, wow, I've got to get back here someday, or wow, I've got to tell somebody about this when I know they're driving through. Just say, hey, when you're driving down Munfordville, it's the easiest thing to remember. It's exit 65 on Interstate 65. You could write a song about it.
Yeah, yeah.
Write yourself a country song about exit 65 on Interstate 65. Get off of it, go a mile, turn right, and there it is. And yeah, there's Stonehenge and stone circles. So, but I've got some ideas of how to make that more memorable than just walking in and seeing a bunch of rocks.
Yeah.
So,
Well, it was memorable when we went, because I don't know if you remember, but that group, I think it was from Elizabethtown, came. It was the church group, and you deputized me as a tour guide. I had never been to Stonehenge. I had maybe been once, but I just walked around. I knew nothing about it. And you were like, come on, we're on. And you and I had... But you had told me so much that I kind of halfway got us through chatting with them. And then I'd be like, well, I don't know. Let's ask Harold what he knows about this. And I remember walking them around and trying to explain that a little bit to them. And then that lady who locked your keys in the truck. You remember that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
How did we help her get that out?
I think I boosted you through the window, and that dog was in there.
Right. And they're able to.
That was... So I'll tell you that I have fond memories of Stonehenge, just because we had kind of a crazy time out there.
Well, I know it brought you back, didn't it?
It certainly brought me
back. Hadn't
back.
been for that experience, you may have just.
Yeah.